Hannah.
I'm Oli.
And I'm Ravennan. And you're listening
to Xenolalia Tapes.
A Moule Podling, brought to you by Hannah Moule and the Moulettes. In this episode, we'll hear from two Moules I'm sure you'll know well. Join Hannah as she sits down with drummer, arranger and producer Oli Moule to talk musical roots, the challenges a 55-piece project can present during a global pandemic, and the importance of breaking barriers and creating space for others in the music industry. This is part one of a two-part podling.
For my part, I'd like to say how pleased I am to have you here, Oli, in this dimly lit, semi-padded environment. And there's a few questions I'd like to ask you about the project.
Sure thing. Hannah, have you prepared the questions?
I've thought about it.
You could have sent me them in advance, so I could have actually thought
I
about it.
I actually am the kind of interviewer that just likes to sort of, I'm very off the cuff actually as a person. And I like to really get the honest responses of my
Subjects. I'm a subject. Okay, well, fire away.
What is the right word? Interviewee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Co-conspirator?
Co-conspirator, collaborator.
Yeah, well, that would be more accurate, really.
Yeah.
In the broader scheme of things.
Well, the first question pertains to the title track of the album Project that we've been working on for
20 years.
100,000 million.
We started, 2 years ago? 2.5 years ago.
The song started bubbling up probably 2.5 years ago, and then it coagulated, I would say, in 2019. Who knows what day it is or what year? We lost a couple of years, it's all right.
A couple of years, yeah.
The song and the project in question is Xenolalia.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell me what Xenolalia means to you?
Xenolalia means many things to me. To try and get a coherent answer out of me, maybe I would have to break it down into a few different aspects of inquiry. So we have what the word means itself. So the word Xenolalia, from your research, was a word that I'd never heard of before. It invoked some significant feelings and thoughts for me because it was very similar to the word glossolalia, which was a term that I was familiar with through my studies, looking into theology and religious studies and stuff like that. So glossolalia is the Greek term for the gift of tongues, which most people would have some understanding of what that is. It's when you hear people speaking in what seems to be very strange or unfamiliar languages as an act of worship or prayer, and it goes back to the fiery tongues of the book of Acts at the beginning of the Christian church. But what's really interesting about Xenolalia is that it's more of a umbrella term for speaking about language broader than glossolalia. So glossolalia, I would say, comes within the umbrella term of Xenolalia. Literally, it means alien talk, doesn't it? Xeno, which we know...
Strangeness.
Yeah.
And familiarity.
Yeah. And lalia, talk, speech. But what I quite like about those two words, Xenolalia, is Xeno... Well, apart from X looking really cool as a word...
It looks great in every font.
Lalia has both a kind of fun-sounding aspect, also... without dwelling too much on it, it kind of almost has a sort of sexual connotation as well. Maybe that's because it sounds like labia.
I've never thought that.
Xenolabia. Lalia, tongues. I suppose tongues can be quite a sexual thing, but I like the fact that you got those two things juxtaposed. You've got this very heavy xeno, which has a very heavy connotation sometimes with words like xenophobia, and I think...
It's quite blocky as a sound, isn't it? Xeno,
yeah.
Whereas lalia does have a skip to it.
I like it's a word that sort of makes you want to explore what it actually means, and perhaps your initial it would probably exceed expectations once you actually look into what it means rather than what your guts tell you what it might mean. What's quite interesting is because of what's been happening in the last few years with the rise of right-wing populism and stuff, and race being right at the forefront, or should I say more accurately, minority ethnic groups within a majority minority political game. I think Xenolalia could also mean the madness of this whole conundrum that we find ourselves in. But literally it means alien talk and speaking a language that's not your own. And again, that's where it's related to tongues and comes underneath the umbrella, because originally tongues was a spiritual gift given to the disciples to go and spread the gospel of the good news. But then, of course, Xenolalia could also mean learning a language.
So I think what you're getting at, how I understood the difference between Xenolalia and glossolalia, for example.
Yeah.
The connotation is that Xenolalia is being able to speak a language that you haven't learned.
And of course, there are other examples apart from being given the gift of tongues where humans can speak a language that they hadn't learnt. Like, there are very rare examples where people have woken from a coma, where they are able to speak a different language, where they've been struck by lightning and they've been able to learn a new language very, very quickly. It's a more scientific term for the phenomena of learning alien languages. We're all learning new languages all the time that we're perhaps not aware of, but discussing language is such a fascinating subject to delve into as a creative person, as well as just general chit chat about it. I think it opens up quite a lot of interesting conversations.
So it's got that nuance of improvisation, which of course translates rather nicely to what we were wanting to do.
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've chosen language as a subject, a concept to explore as musicians. I think there's not only a very clear symbiotic relationship, but there is an ancient relationship between music and language itself. I really like some of the studies of linguists and cultural evolutionists talking about, quite persuasively talking about how music predates language, but very much sets the scene for complex ideas and emotions to be communicated. It's not very difficult to imagine how that might have happened with humans hitting stuff, singing, trying to convey emotions in a complicated way. You can see how that might happen. And then, of course, whales sing songs to each other. There's bird song.
Male mice sing tiny, tiny mouse songs.
I think probably my two favourite things about being human, our complex language system and the infinite amount of possibilities that's facilitated, and then music. Those are the things that really, really define us and our species, and I think those two things are really worth celebrating.
And music just leads to dancing, and that's the other thing.
Yeah, which is another language within itself, is another way of communicating. And yeah, I'd imagine dance has probably been around before complex language as well. So yeah, I think it's a really great subject to delve into. And of course, musicians like to communicate through their instruments. There is a beautiful connection that players have with their instruments and the music that they make. It's a way in which they can communicate, and I think by looking into language and looking at the infinite possibilities, the way that we can then apply that to how we think about the creative process has been quite an interesting thing to explore. As Moules, we've in the past we've tried to bring several languages of music together, deconstructing it, playing with different elements of different stuff, using slightly unorthodox instrumentation, playing with the idea that there is new combinations of musical sounds and musical ideas that can be in a conversation with each other. I think we've tried to do that. But what's interesting about the five is that it sort of allows us to almost invert that principle and say, well, instead of trying to put them in one pot, we try and draw out the individual elements of what we've tried to put together in the past, and allow ourselves to enjoy and go along the sort of the language of certain arrangement styles and instrumentation, like you would in a conversation with someone in a particular language, or in a more broader sense, philosophically, in a different language game. You can stay within certain parameters. It allows us to kind of explore in a way that we've never explored before.
I found it allows us to dig in, expand and enjoy and experiment with some of our favourite types of music, which might be a cappella groups, choral groups, string ensembles, horns bands.
Or just rocking out,
of course. But also, I think the other thing to emphasise is the fact that at the core of the project was the idea of reimagining and recontextualising this body of 11 songs.
Yeah.
So it's not like, the thing to point out is it's not just a re-instrumentation, it's a rewrite every time.
And that's what was really interesting about taking it and allowing them to inform each other by really stretching out the melody and the words and the instrumentation. What it's done is it's allowed a whole nother process of taking the song and taking the meaning of the song and pushing that further through several different creative processes. And I don't know anyone who's really done that before. I mean, you get it with bands who have to play the same songs over and over again, and they might occasionally come up with like an acoustic album, or they might do a tour with a pianist or something. But what's really interesting about this project is that from the outset, we bring all those building blocks in at the start of the process, not like a jazz standard that evolves over several decades. This is right at the start, the building blocks. It's like a Venn diagram, isn't it, of overspilling the different circles overlapping. And what you found as a songwriter is how you thought you'd written 3 verses to a song or something, and then when you go and explore the string version or the horns version and we want vocals, you realise that it's sort of lending itself to new words. And that's just, it's lovely to see that process unfold.
I think those have been the most satisfying examples during this project. The ones I'm happiest with are the ones that have taken on a whole new life and a whole new story. That's my attachment and my prerogative as a lyricist and the songwriter. So that might not be what everybody's favourite thing would be about it, but for me, I find that really exciting, that it takes on another lap, another loop, and it means something different. And I think the reason why that idea has resonance right now, or at least how I've been relating to it emotionally now in this context of time and place, is that I guess being enamoured of the idea of trying to experience an idea from different perspectives, or trying to recontextualise it so that it's not a sort of grinding, this is my point of view and that's it, I guess, which we're getting a bit too much of.
I mean, I think, I
didn't express that very well, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Bringing it within the political context of where there is a lot of miscommunication going on, and it reminds me of the many different ways of talking about communication and what we're seeing at the moment with so many heated debates. It reminds me of Ken Wilber, Integral Theory, where he divides our communication and meaning into objective, subjective, collective and individual as a grid. And actually most of our interactions are sort of moving between these 4. We sometimes get stuck and misunderstand each other between these 4. You know, you can have someone like Jordan Peterson and Gabor Mate talking about their preferred subject, both flipping from subjective and objective and from their professional and from their private experience, but have come to completely different conclusions, and the sort of the dialectical process of trying to understand each other, the big questions, left and right.
Yeah.
Thinking about Jordan Peterson debate with Sam Harris again, and that was really interesting about truth. They couldn't even agree with what truth was, so the debate didn't even really get off the ground. But it's no coincidence, again, that music, as musicians, creative people, we're exploring language and process and meaning. Music is one of the only things that really lights the brain up and heals. You know, the healing part, the healing of music, it actually really allows pathways, neurological pathways to connect. The whole brain lights up. And that in itself is a really important thing that music can do with people who think in different ways. There is a lot of echo chamber tribalism, and people are getting stuck within their very entrenched ways of communicating, and
Sort of bipartisan.
yeah, and I think being able to explore subtext and context within a creative arena really sort of allows us to sort of, well, it's a therapy. There's a therapeutic element to it, but there's also something very profound that can happen in as we explore the ideas differently and continually challenge ourselves to re-explore meaning, truth, communication, ideas. And also, I think what's really important, I remember when we were thinking about the concept of the next album, when we were having that conversation, was the idea of just going through the treadmill of another album in a world that feels so saturated, as well as a world that's in flux and changing. The idea of another band, 15 years into its career, doing another album in a changing world where the album format, for better or for worse, is not as valued as it was. In a world where content seems to be the buzzword and,
I don't like it.
There's a pressure for artists to show that they're doing stuff all the time, and being aware of that as a context obviously impacted our decision of how to do it in a way that suited us, rather than doing it in a way that we're expected to because of the industry. And we're sort of caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. In one sense, we're expected to come out with just another album, and then in another sense, we're expected to come up with constant content. So what do we do in response to that? Well, we like the idea of having a concept and an idea of a release, number 5, but as a way of tackling some of our existential
dread
that's been going on, as well as providing a structure in which we can be creative all the time, keep ourselves interested, but also the fact that touring has become such an important part of the struggling middle ground economy. We were looking at how we can keep this thing going when record sales are plummeting all the time, and digital revenue is, it's always there, but it's dwindling. And even when at the end of our touring, we noticed that CD sales at shows, which were very important, because of the culture shift, it became less and less normal for people to just want to buy CDs at shows. People are still doing it, but as time goes on and this new sort of era unfolds, it's becoming apparent that artists have to change, and I much prefer a world where artists lead the change rather than it being dictated to us of how to do things. That's where artists are at their best. So I think Xenolalia is a product of that. It's a product of the politics of the time now. It's a product of us being this far into our career and wanting to do something different. It's also, a product of the industry and how we're going to make it work for us
I mean, I think sometimes ponder this, that it's one of those... Okay, so it's one of those industries where the given isn't that as you continue to do your craft, you're going to get better at it, which you could probably say most industries would imagine that might be the case. You know, you keep doing it, you keep practicing it, you get better, and then, you know, that experience is valued. That isn't necessarily the case in music, I think. There's things obscuring that process. But I think the process of practicing obviously is really important.
Well, I think also we've found ourselves in quite a strange conundrum, because there's a sort of, in my opinion, this sort of pseudo romanticisation of promoting a sort of a half-baked, not very good, but not very competent way of playing and writing music. And what's really frustrating is that I come from a self-taught punk background where it was all about 3 chords and making it accessible and making people realise that it was music, it can be played by anyone. I think that was in the 70s. We've moved on. We've moved on from that now, and then of course there was a rebellion. So there was the punk versus prog, and then obviously also during the 70s was a real great time for black music. Black music, obviously, when it sort of came into Western commercial markets, it was jazz, rock and roll, funk, soul. The musicianship celebrated there was huge. And then obviously hip hop happened, and there was this sort of championing of simple music. And of course the ebb and flow of that happens. But what I find really annoying is that things aren't allowed to, and they're stuck in these old narratives, even to the point where you have a lot of, I don't know, very privileged kids who can play complex instruments and they're pretending that they can't, you know, or it's not cool to play complicated music. You know, you want to pretend that you're, I don't know, a deprived working class kid who hasn't had an instrument, or things like these narratives that sort of get perpetuated. In my opinion, complicated music and actually dedicating your life to craft of playing an instrument, that is way more punk rock, really, than pretending that you can only play 3 chords, you know. But yeah, I think there's all these narratives in the mix of things, and we've, as Moules, there's always been a mixture of people that have come from trained backgrounds to self-taught backgrounds, and I really like how those two things influence each other.
I think though, when I try and put my finger on what it is about music that's important, because I don't think it has to be, you know, music doesn't have to be complex, it doesn't have to be simple, it doesn't have to be anything actually. It just, the thing that makes it important is is the alchemy of it. You know, when you see musicians change the mood of the room, change people's minds, change, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I still believe that music and sport are the 2 things that bring the most diverse amount of people together into a consensus of enjoyment, fun, sense of togetherness. You know, those 2 things, music and sport, are more powerful than anything else. That's why it's a really great endeavour, and it's one of the motivating things that, you know, is why we do what we do.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of Hannah and Oli in session for Xenolalia tapes. The discussion continues in part 2, available now. But before we go, we'd like to give huge thanks to our Patreons for their encouragement, support, and general good vibes. If you'd like to become a Patreon or fancy learning more about our mega project, head over to www.patreon.com/Moulettes. Hello, I'm Hannah.
I'm Oli.
And I'm Ray Bennon. And you're listening to Xenolalia Tapes. A Moule Podling, brought to you by Hannah Moule and the Moulettes. This is part 2 of a 2-part podling. If you haven't heard part 1, you can listen wherever you found this one. We'll be right here, eagerly awaiting your return. Now, back to Hannah and Oli in the studio.
Ow. I hurt my hand from cutting wood with an axe. This is the kind of lockdown blister I get. Rather than drum blisters, I get chopping wood with an axe blister.
Is that more wholesome?
I mean, it's occurred from one full day of chopping, whereas gig blisters, obviously, you kind of play on top of them and then they just sort of build over a course of time.
I miss my calluses.
Yeah, I'm quite looking forward to getting some of my calluses back.
Apparently you can rub garlic on your fingers.
And wee on them.
And wee on them. White spirit actually does work. No, surgical spirit. What's the difference? Just as a side note, I'm just sorry for my own thought process. When I think about refining, distilling the art of songcraft, or the way that you can pursue that as a vocation, or it's about getting close as you can to distilling your thoughts and touching, I guess, some kind of universal truth.
Well, that comes back to universal language, and again it relates back to music predating language, and I think music and feeling predate literally in time, they predate the words that we're saying. So the words, every time we speak, the music that we make is always a symbol, isn't it? It's a symbol of something that's coming from within. And I mean, in language terms, we're talking about someone like Noam Chomsky, who championed universal grammar and this very thing that language is innate in us. The actual nuts and bolts of language are innate in our actual physical being. And the words that we actually say, they're all symbols of something underneath that's within our actual physical makeup as humans. So the language is a physical property. It's an organ in our brain. The networks in our brain are already there. The words are just it's a response to what's happening. And the same goes for music. Music comes from somewhere, but the ideas and the feelings are there before. And that's what's really interesting when you work in a band together, that the collective consciousness that happens. It's probably one of the closest things that you get to proving collective consciousness when you're in a band and you're playing together and you're responding at what seems to what most people observing, it seems like light speed. But what you've got to realise is that communication that we're doing as musicians, that's happening before the sounds come out. The communication and the conversation's it's already happened. That's where the overlap of talking about language and music gets really interesting, because there's lots of great studies on that.
Body language, You notice that have you ever played a gig in a mask, or when you've had your peripheral vision cut or something like that?
Yeah.
Suddenly you realise how much you're using all of that field of vision without consciously processing it. And very interesting, isn't it, that full body response that you have to play as... I've had occasions where I've played with people who haven't even known before the happening of playing. And sometimes you get that connection where you can just play.
Well, the speed of thought, it's really interesting to also listening to Sam Harris, who's one of the four horsemen of the unapocalypse. He's a neuroscientist.
The Unapocalypse?
Yeah, so you have Hitch, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they're all friends, and they went on on the offensive on loads of things. But Sam Harris is a neuroscientist, and he talks about free will. Both Dan Dennett and Sam Harris, they disagree on certain things on free will, but the evidence is there that the thoughts, there will be machines that can tell us what we're going to say before we even say it. So the indicators, the thoughts, the processes have already happened before we know it. It's the speed in which it's happening. And this puts in this whole debate about free will. We think that we're coming up with these ideas as we speak them, but our brain's already decided what it's gonna say before we've said it. And the same goes for music and the process of music. We're operating on a much faster level than we can understand in the moment consciously, which again, both the implications of that for language formation and language accountability, and also for music, is really, really fascinating.
That's why I love singing so much. That's why I always would recommend that anybody trying to, if you're trying to learn something or you're trying to write something, just try and sing it. And if anyone's learning instruments, I think it's so valuable to be able to sing, because it cuts out.
Again, it comes back to the singing and hitting things, which is the stuff. It's the oldest type of music, isn't it?
Yeah. It cuts out any other chain of command, so you don't have to tell your hand to do the thing. You just sing the thing. Singing
is the purest, and then hitting is this very much in second. But then that's why so much music is really down to the nuts and bolts of rhythm and words and melody. Those are the things that we as humans respond to first. Ultimately, it's usually what we can remember about the songs that we like. We think about the melody, the words and the rhythm, the groove. And then when we hear those things, that's the powerful alchemy.
I just think I've got such a vast musical memory and I can't remember what I did yesterday.
Yeah.
The way that music informs memory is really... I also think it's really valuable to learn stuff off by heart. I think it's really good for your brain. To segue onwards...
Yeah.
We decided to do this project before the global pandemic.
We did, yeah.
And we'd already put it into action. We'd started work. We had all the songs. We'd started working.
We'd also started planning 3 years of touring.
3 years of touring. We'd done the Venn diagram.
Yeah. There was a lot of work that went in, and then things changed.
We were going to go to Japan.
Oh man. We were, weren't we?
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
How do you think that the lockdown has changed? The lockdown and current events and the situation that we find ourselves in, how do you think that's informed the work that we've been doing?
I think it's easy perhaps to force a convenient sense of relevant meaning to the project in terms of lockdown. I think communication is such a broad subject. It would have been relevant even with what was happening politically before COVID. I think communication had a relevance. I think also celebrating music eclecticism and being prolific and collaboration with all the different players, that again would have been very relevant before lockdown. I think the fact that lockdown happened in this era has only served to really enforce some of the ideas that we were talking about before, and if anything, sadly, has really reiterated the need for human communion and communication in a way that I don't think we could have ever anticipated. And so the fact that it makes the project even more poignant and relevant, I think, is a coincidence, but one that's been really fascinating to experience. And what's been really interesting is the process of recording separate from each other through overdubs and sending files and trying to orchestrate essentially 30 or so players across the internet, and has been a really interesting, unique part of the process. Whereas usually our preferred way of working, isn't it, is like choose the army and sort of, dig the trench and stay there for 5 or 6 weeks, which is usually that's usually what we've done in the past.
I do like an immersive time.
Yeah, so this project has opened up a whole nother way of working for us that, I'm not going to lie, has been complicated and a pain in the ass.
Because everybody hates files.
Everyone hates files. The way that how many files we have to deal with these days, the amount of internet conversations, Zoom calls, phone calls, and how that's actually impacted the quality of audio with people recording in different ways, different rooms, and the challenges that's presented to mix. For me, has been a real interesting process. It's also it's been really good to encourage musicians who hadn't had a setup to get some more equipment. In fact, we actually bought some players some basic recording equipment so they could get us their ideas to us.
I think having the project on the go and at the beginning of lockdown was a really sustaining thing. For me, that's how I felt it, because suddenly actually a lot of people didn't have any work, so they were in one place, stationary, and they were up for it, and so we got a lot of people involved who might not have been so able to commit to it with their time.
That's true, yeah, and I think the best example of collaboration that sort of came together was the Idiolect video, wasn't it? The company that we sometimes work with, Stopgap, a dance company, you know, all of the dancers were stuck at home, and they probably more than anyone need to, you know, have collaborative
together.
Sessions and not being cooped up at home. You know, dancers really need to...
They do a lot.
They need to perform more than musicians do in a way. If you go back and watch the Idiolect video, you'll realise that all the footage is just people in their bedrooms, but we've sort of cut together something that was quite stylised. In spite of everything, creativity still just finds a way, and artists find a way to communicate and make something beautiful. And yeah, again, that's where I like to see artists leading the way. In times like this lockdown, it's been really great to feel the responsibility to create and have fun in spite of some of the bad things that are happening. And I really enjoyed the stream gigs that we did, you know, on Twitch. We had that initial gig, we had like 130 people there, and then it sort of whittled down, didn't it, to sort of a core bunch of people who really got something out of the weekly performances. And yeah, it was quite weird, but at the same time it was really good to feel like we were helping people.
I like the improv gigs, and then I enjoyed them.
Yeah.
Pineapple Shame.
I think the impacts of it and the lessons learned, I just hope we do actually learn some lessons. I think that's probably the biggest challenge. And again, the responsibility comes down to the individual and what they decide to learn from this. But I don't want to return to the same world. And already things have changed quite a lot since the beginning of lockdown. If you think about it, there's been a lot happen. Brexit, United States, shift of government, Myanmar, Iran tensions. I mean, the world keeps on going and keeps on changing, and what was so memorable and what I would love to pass on is that sense of calm. Do you remember when that first lockdown, when traffic stopped?
Oh yeah, birds.
And just reminding people that actually, yes, we were all miserable, but at the same time there was joy to be had from the fact that things had just...
I think there was a sense of blessed relief in some ways. I have to say not for very long, because then I realised we had a multi-ensemble 55-piece of music project to push on with. But there was a point where I just thought, oh, well, I don't have to feel like I'm constantly under pressure to do things, because actually I just can't do any of this, and neither can all of these other people either. So how do you break this down? What's the important part? But that is a consequence of a certain amount of privilege and luxury. I think the idea that having time to reevaluate things and not just constantly barrel onwards.
Inbuilt big holidays, you know.
Purges.
Purges.
Purge.
The most important type of communication is in the flesh, and finding ways to creatively commune together rather than indirectly. And I think that's one of the best things musicians can do and facilitate communication together in the room rather than using devices. And again, travelling, cars, roads, planes, they're all ways that have expanded our way to communicate together on a broader term. But I still, if I was given the choice to get rid of them, I probably still would. The reason why I like being a musician is there's the freedom knowing that you can turn up somewhere and commune in a nice way together wherever you go. Musicians can still do that. I mean, particularly now we have a way of getting to mainland continent quite easily. It took lockdown to sort of reiterate a new world where things could be different, as well as thinking about how things were in the past as well, with the modern age sort of brought to a slight standstill. And then it made me think, still as musicians really would be all right. That's probably my favourite thing about horns. Again, horns and drums. If the apocalypse does happen and we have no electricity, horns and drums can bring a big party.
No electricity needed.
No electricity needed. Horns can bring an apocalypse party. Of course, singing, group singing. Strings, if you've got lots of them, you can't beat that sort of
primordial soup.
Primordial soup, which I hope some of that comes across in what we're communicating with this project, with the horns ensembles, drums and the a cappella. The strings one is sort of different and quite intimate recordings and harmonically very complicated. And then electronica music, the evolution of electronica music has been such an amazing ride in terms of what it achieved. Look at the impact and the meaning of what dance music did to culture, and the positives and the negatives, but the shift, the seismic shift that it created and represented was massive, and you can't beat it in terms of acoustic instruments or electric instruments. It just can't touch some of the places that dance music can really hit. And I really like the fact that it suddenly wasn't about the band, it was about the collective experience of hearing the music and dancing together, rather than sort of putting this band on a pedestal. Also, just in terms of sonically, how it's pushed the way we listen to music and respond to it, and the production, whether it be through getting a really great analog chain of synthesizers and modulators and drum machines and things, and just kind of letting them do their things. That approach to electronic music is really fascinating. And then you've got the other school of electronic production, which concentrates and focuses bar by bar, like in very, very specific detail. Aphex Twin or Noisia or those kind of producers where every single bar is this crafted thing. Both schools are really great, but it's really great to explore all those different things. Electric, that's sort of where I come from, the rock side of things. There's nothing that quite conveys a wild energy like 3, 4, 5 people plugged into these speakers that could explode or feedback at any time, conveying that energy and wildness as a group, as a sweating
unit.
You can't really beat that. It's its own type of energy that it's a type of communication, not only between the band in the chaos of an electric gig, which is wild, but also the wildness of the sound that you're putting out there and how that impacts the audience is electric. That again, exploring the songs through that medium, it just brings out so many different things.
Just for a final wrapping up.
Mm-hmm.
Apart from me, you're the oldest surviving member of the band.
Surviving.
Surviving, that's maybe a bit misleading. I guess remaining?
Well, not all of them are around anymore.
Contending?
Sadly. But,
yeah, but I don't want to imply that none of them are. Anyway, it's been a long old time. You're still here. How would you describe your role? How do you see yourself within Moules?
I owe Moulettes a lot in terms of being the most fertile ground for my development as a musician. So my identity is very much tied. From my initial sort of Kurt Cobain worshipping first few years of music, Moulettes to me represents a moving away from that.
Although the cello was Kurt Cobain's favourite instrument.
It was, which is why he got the cellist from Rasputina to play on the seminal Nirvana Unplugged album. And therefore it was my favourite instrument before I even knew why it should be. Thankfully, I found a cellist, Hannah, when I was 16, and I was invited to join the band. But cello, I can still say quite honestly that cello is still my favourite instrument. So it's pretty convenient, really, that I live with a cellist. But what struck me right from the beginning, and still is the same with Hannah's songwriting and her as a cellist, and then with Ruth, and then the other women that have played such an important role in the band. And now, of course, it's the power duo of Ray and Hannah. What struck me as something so appealing and something new and something very inspiring and just very attractive was the fact that you had, without sounding patronising or trying not to sound patronising, I was drawn to the fact that there was women who were making music that they wanted to make in their own way that didn't seem to be that preoccupied with what was expected of them. It was both Hannah and Ruth were very singular and independent and driven, and as a 16-year-old, you don't encounter that energy, or at least you didn't, and I would probably argue that you still don't encounter that energy as much as you should. So when you see it and you feel it, it's very, very attractive and interesting and curious because it's new. And from that point on, from seeing Hannah play a cello in the place where we used to just meet up to smoke at college, outside the college campus, I was hooked from the start. I just genuinely believed that these two women were on to something that I'd never experienced before and I hadn't really felt before. And I realised that my delusions of wanting to be in a rock band that could change the world, first of all, that was kind of an old idea that wasn't very new. It was very based in perhaps a very sort of masculine way of looking at things as well, but the world was much bigger than I'd realised, and I then realised I'd be very satisfied playing a subservient role to that new energy that I would grow into understanding, and that's what I still see my role as now, is the idea of me being another male artist when I know that there's so much untapped potential with women in music that we just don't need another guy being at the forefront of things. We've had so much of that, and so my role always has been to try and help Hannah and other women. Georgina was a really big impact on me, seeing how great she was at the violin and how these musicians had their own personality and I would argue still be underappreciated. I just thought, wow, there's so much work to be done in terms of people playing a supportive role to people that actually have some new things to contribute to the world. That's always been my role, really, and at least Hannah's convinced me that I'm sometimes helpful, bringing the goodness of original female music. And people will say, well, you shouldn't put gender on it. But once we get to the point where I feel that there is an adequate amount of women that are represented, both in terms of the hierarchy of the industry, decision makers, producers, sound engineers, songwriters that aren't just being pretty and playing the same old songs that people are expecting to play, or shaking their ass in the same way that
shaking an egg,
making that so much of the music industry want women to do. Once we start seeing a much more representative of the reality of people, then I will carry on talking about gender in this context, because it does matter. And we still haven't developed the language of knowing what a world where women are able to be 100% creative and be celebrated for that.
Come a long way. We got a long way to go.
We've got a long way to go. Having managed this band as well for several years, I've come across certain barriers that I don't think people fully appreciate, and there is work to be done. So yeah, that's my role, as well as being a drummer and an arranger or producer or mixer. I will just do whatever role is sort of required of me that helps the thing move a bit further. That's it really. And I am happy, you know. I'm not repressing much by doing. I might be repressing a little bit, but it doesn't feel like I'm holding back. If anything, like I said before, it really sort of has opened up so many new things for me. It's so tied into my identity as a creative person as well as a human being, you know, as we sort of move from being 16 to now in our mid-30s.
As we stagger into the unknown future.
In 20 years' time, I want kids to stumble across us in a tent somewhere in a festival and go, what the actual I didn't realise that this kind of thing existed. And if we can still be doing that, then I really feel like we've achieved something. If you want to check out a really interesting resource, check out the F list, collated for women who are and non-binary people that should be booked in the place of the same old acts that really make some great music.
That's different because I know about Book More Women, which is the American organisation. They display the posters and they take off.
Yeah, the bands that had women, even just one member were left on the poster. And if you wanted to see where there's still such a big imbalance, the posters obviously are less than half full. And that's just with a band with one woman in rather than a band that's being led by a woman. There are all these great bands with women in, not just women in the lineup, but led by women that they're not just bands that are up and coming. They're bands that have got a following, that have, you know, sold records, that have been played on the radio, that have ticked so many of the boxes but yet still don't get booked. And so there's a real uphill struggle there that's institutionally prohibitive.
And really the only thing to underline in that is that we all lose from that narrow-minded consumption of just this very limited monoculture. Monoculture in any form is always bad news.
There is quality.
Isn't it more interesting to hear all sorts of different things than it is to hear the same sort of thing? I mean, that's my point really. But I think just to wrap up, I wanted you to tell me what your favourite song so far in the Xenolalia Project was and what one you're most excited about.
I think probably my favourite still is the picture frame electric version. In terms of the scope that it shows, it's got like the best of album 1, 3 and 4 all together in one, and it kind of does all of them really well. There's something about that track does it for me in terms of if you were to sort of do a snapshot of our that sort of sums up what we've done in the past. And although that's kind of in one sense that's sort of romanticising looking backwards, I think it's nice to feel like that sense of completion that to me stands out quite significantly.
And what is it that you're most excited about?
I'm really excited about the Rosehill residency when all the ensembles are going to have a go at certain arrangements over the course of the week. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that all pans out.
Yes, how will we remember?
So get your
different versions of different things.
Get your sweet booties down to Rosehill during our tour in November. We're starting the tour with the residency, aren't we? Before we go all around the place. And you can buy a ticket that gives you access to 4 nights, or you can just come and see the show on the Saturday, which will incorporate all the ensembles in one big hoo-ha of a musical vomit.
Primordial soup.
It won't be vomit. It will be a lot of music, a lot of notes. Perhaps one of the most jam-filled pieces of musical consciousness and communication that's happened.
There'll be some great players.
Yeah, there's going to be 30 players,
It'll be a great,
musicians there.
great occasion.
We're going to weave all together the ensembles into
And
one
they're
big
going to be playing
performance.
their own songs, and it'll be really nice.
It's going to be magical. And Beck Plexus is going to be joining us to support for that whole tour and for the residency with her partner, No Compliments. I think they're going under the name of No Plexus for the tour, and they are both great women and great artists. That's what I'm looking forward to the most as the sort of conclusion of this whole project. That's going to be really interesting to see.
On that note, thanks for joining me here. Frankly, I'm intimidated by the. It's just this sense of trying to remember things that are very similar but not quite the same. We'll see. Probably be fine.
Oh, yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very
I'm
much.
sorry, that's all we got time for.
We hope you have enjoyed this Moule Podling. To find out more about our Xenolalia mega project, head to our website at moulettes.co.uk. That's moulettes.co.uk. Keep those ears open for a brand new Moulettes podcast, available soon, wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much to our Patreons for their support and encouragement. If you'd like to enter the multiverse and become a much-loved Patreon, visit www.patreon.com/MOULETTS Moulettes.
What's the difference between Gary Oldman and Gary Newman?
Haircuts, mainly. Who am I thinking about? Gary...
You're thinking of Michael Newman?
No.
Neumann.
The guitarist, Gary...
Oh, no, not Gary. The 80s.
Yeah, you like it. You like him.
I don't like him.
Gary...
I know you mean he's got hair. It's really curly. And he does blues rock. You can see his exact face.
Gary, guitarist.
Gary Moore. Well, that's different again.
Gary Moore, Gary Newman, Gary Oldman. Three very different Garys. The pantheon of
Men.
Creative men in the 80s.
And up to the present day.